Okay, thank you so much, colleagues, students, and friends. Assalamu alaikum and greetings from Lahore, Pakistan. On behalf of the Center for Critical Peace Studies, I'm very pleased and honored to welcome you all to this very special public lecture by Professor Syed Farid Alatas, who is one of the most distinguished contemporary scholars in the field of decolonial studies. This lecture on Eurocentrism, coloniality of knowledge, and the need to decolonize the canon is extremely significant in the current global context, where we see that the defiance of the global south is finally shaping the global futures. Today, the news from Pakistan regarding the US-Iran talks are not very positive, as the two sides could not reach an agreement yet. But these talks do help us see the limits of the existing power structures and the power of defiance of the oppressed. And I think all of us can sense that these are transforming times. And it's extremely important in these transforming times to imagine and enact knowledge systems that help us shape livable, breathable, and humane futures. So today's lecture will hopefully guide us in this direction. Let me formally introduce the speaker for our broader audience. Syed Farid Alatas is Professor of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. He headed the Department of Malay Studies at National University of Singapore from 2007 till 2013. He lectured at the University of Malay in the Department of Southeast Asian Studies prior to joining National University of Singapore. Professor Alatas has authored numerous books and articles, including Ibn Khaldun, Applying Ibn Khaldun, The Recovery of a Lost Tradition in Sociology, with Vinita Sinha, Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, and his new book is forthcoming, Decolonization of Knowledge from the Malay World. His areas of interest are sociology of Islam, social theory, religion and reform, intra and interreligious dialogue, and the study of Eurocentrism. We are honored to have you here, Professor Syed Farid Alatas, and everyone is very eager to listen to you. So it's over to you.
Right. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Dr. Fatima, for your nice introduction and also for the invitation to speak to all of you on this topic. Can you hear me well? Yeah, thank you. So my presentation is quite simple. I have a very I guess simple aim or objective, and that is to say that the reason to decolonize knowledge is not only because of the Eurocentricity or coloniality of knowledge, but it is also because of the Eurocentricity or coloniality of the world itself. So it is not only knowledge which is colonial, which is Eurocentric, and that is a legacy of colonialism. But the world itself continues to operate in such a way that the structures, the economic structures and regimes, the mode of interstate relations, all revolve around the interests of the West, particularly the United States. So this means that the context within which we study knowledge creation is the context of neo-colonialism, which is the I think one of the main points that I want to make. That is one main point. The context of studying knowledge creation, the context of studying coloniality and Eurocentricity of knowledge is neo-colonialism. The second point that I would like to make in this presentation is that because there has been pushback against the neo-colonial conditions in which we live. Pushback not only in academia, but more importantly, pushback from states, from institutions, international institutions, but also states. There has been an attempt to, let us say, reassert coloniality, and this has resulted in a form of discourse which I call pro-colonial thought, and I will make the point later that pro-colonial thought as it exists today differs from pro-colonial thought as it existed during the colonial period. So these are I think the 2 points that I want to, well, there are 3 points actually. So that first is that the critique of knowledge today is in the context of neo-colonialism, and that has resulted in pushback in the form of, that has resulted in pushback from many states in the global south. And as a reaction to that, you have the emergence of pro-colonial thought. So these are what I will discuss today. Now, the most basic distinction that I need to make in order to continue is that there is the discursive and practical dimensions of decolonization. So the discursive dimension refers to the decolonization of knowledge. It's an intellectual activity. The practical dimension of decolonization refers to attempts to actually decolonize our political, economic structures. It's got to do with decolonization in the real world, not in the realm of discourse, not in the realm of the mind, but in the realm of the way we actually practice our lives, the way we actually live our lives. So there's the practical, the discursive, and the practical dimensions of decolonization. And I'll give some examples of that later on. Now, when we talk about the discursive level of decolonization, as we have discussed in the past, you have what is necessary to do is to identify the traits of Eurocentrism. I have mentioned before the three, what I consider to be the 3 core traits of Eurocentrism: the false universalism, the distortion of reality, silencing, which includes the marginalization or even total silencing of the intellectual traditions of non-Western civilizations and regions and societies and so on. There's a lot to the identification of these traits. A lot of work needs to be done to identify the various traits of Eurocentrism. We have until now about 500 years of colonialism, European colonialism since 1492, since the Spaniards and the Portuguese went to the Americas and colonized the Americas. We have 500 years of different types of colonial thought based on different types of colonialism, whether it's settler colonialism, internal colonialism, extractive colonialism, plantation colonialism, semi-colonialism. So 500 years of different types of colonialism. You have a very complicated potpourri of anti-colonial thought, and that I think is a project that is by no means complete. But this is the critical aspect of decolonizing knowledge. There's also the creative or constructive aspect, which is which has to do with creating new knowledge, constructing new knowledge. So when we talk about discursive decolonization, we are referring to the critique of colonial Eurocentric knowledge on the one hand, and the construction of new knowledge away from Eurocentrism on the other hand. Now, the importance of recognizing colonial or Eurocentric knowledge is not only for its own sake, simply because Eurocentric knowledge is problematic as knowledge construction goes. It's problematic because it is based on problematic traits, false universalisms and so on. But it is also very important because it veils the Eurocentricity of the world itself. The distortions and the silencing that you find that we can identify in Eurocentric knowledge has a function of veiling the way in which the world functions around the interests of Euro-America. Let me just give you two examples. In much of the world, in our media, whether in the West or in the non-West, we continuously refer to the occupation of Israel. I think, I'm assuming maybe you can comment, Dr. Fatima, is this the case in Urdu language in Pakistan? Do they refer to occupation when they speak about the West Bank or when they speak about Gaza? I know in many countries, even in the Arab world, in the Arabic media, they use the term occupation in Arabic. Now, this is an example for me of this veiling that I'm talking about, because sociologically speaking, it is not occupation; it is colonialism. Colonization is a far more invasive process and situation than occupation. So, when you speak about Israel and Palestine, the occupation refers to, Israel in Syria, Israel in South Lebanon. This is occupation. It is temporary. It doesn't involve the building of institutions, universities, hospitals, banks, infrastructure, but you do get that with colonization. So the West Bank is colonized. Israel itself is a settler colonial state, Israel proper. Parts of the West Bank are becoming more and more settled. They are what you see is the spread of settler colonialism. Gaza, up until October 2023, was a semi-colonial state. Was not occupied directly, not colonized directly by the Israelis, but controlled from the outside. So it would be similar. It would be, we would understand it in terms of what is called semi-colonialism, and so on and so forth. But yet, so there is semi-colonialism, there is settler colonialism in Israel-Palestine. There is also occupation, which is a different thing, right? We can refer to, as I said, parts of Syria and South Lebanon as under Israeli occupation, but we cannot, I think, in terms of how the terms are understood in political economy and sociology, we can't refer to the West Bank, to Israel itself, or to Gaza as occupied territories. They're far more than being occupied territories. Another term which is really related to what I'm discussing today is postcolonial. So postcolonial is a term that's related to postcolonial theory or postcolonialism, which which has to do with a specific approach in postcolonial theory or postcolonialism, an approach to the study of the colonial legacies that we find in the world today. hence the term post-colonial. In other words, we have passed the colonial period, but we continue to suffer from the legacies of colonialism, and that is what post-colonialism studies. But and I agree with the post-colonial theorists that we have this legacy. This is what we're dealing with. That's why we want to decolonize knowledge, and that's why we want to decolonize the world. But I have a slight quarrel with the use of the term post-colonial, because I don't think we are in a post-colonial world, right? And maybe we should just settle this once and for all and not pretend that we are post-colonial. I mean, we are still colonial, very much so. And I think it has always been the case. In 1955, during the Bandung Conference, President Sukarno, who convened the conference, made this point that don't think that we are independent, even though we have received formal independence. We still live under the domination and the tutelage of the Western powers. And he, as well as others at the conference, used the term neo-colonialism. And I think that is probably a more accurate description of our situation, of our condition. In other words, the human condition today in much of the world, in the global majority, is neo-colonialism. This is our human condition, along with other understandings of human condition, such as alienation, anomie, and so on. But I think it's high time that in the global south, in the global majority, we recognize neo-colonialism as a basic, fundamental, and of course problematic human condition. I think recent events have really emphasized or driven home the point that we live in a neo-colonial world. I don't think much has changed since in the last 50, 60 years, since countries in Asia and Africa obtained independence. I don't think things have changed, that we are now neo-colonial as opposed to 50 years ago. We have always been neo-colonial, but I think recent events have probably helped to drive that point home. You look at the abduction of the President and First Lady of Venezuela. You look at the US blockade against Cuba, which is causing economic, financial, and other kinds of crisis. Very, doesn't receive much attention in the media, but what is going on in Cuba is something very inhumane. You obviously, the war, the genocide against Gaza is another example of that. And then finally, the war against Iran. So all these, show the reflect the fact that countries in the global south are not in charge of their own destinies, and the manner in which they are not in charge of their own destinies is not only to be understood in military terms. There's also so in other words, the imperialism of neocolonialism is not simply a military matter. It's also a political matter. It's also an economic matter. There's the politics of imperialism, and there's the economics of imperialism. The economics of imperialism have to do with the sheer economic power of the United States and the Europeans. And of course, the economics of imperialism is implemented or is derivative of the politics of imperialism when political decisions are made. For example, when a political decision is made to impose sanctions, unilaterally impose sanctions on countries, on any country that the United States wishes to sanction. right? So here you have an example of the political economy of imperialism, and it's quite separate from the U.S. military involvement, um, and all these aspects of imperialism have devastating effects on the world. We know the effects of military involvement. The U.S. has been involved in dozens and dozens of covert operations and military intervention since the conclusion of World War II. Dozens around the world. I think the majority would have been in Latin America, but several in Asia, and even a few in Africa. So you have the military side. In terms of the economic side, sanctions, and I was quite shocked to learn that to learn about the devastating effects of sanctions. There was an article published in the Lancet, which is a medical journal published in the United Kingdom, and last year, I think in November or December, there was a special issue on the health effects of sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union between 1971 and 1971 and 2021, so a 50-year period. And the data is shocking. Something like 39 million deaths due to economic sanctions around the world. I mean, this is, one cannot refer to this as anything but satanic. And this is without a single shot being fired. 39 million deaths, the mortality of 39 million because of economic sanctions, because you know how economic sanctions affect delivery of healthcare, of medicine, and food, and so on and so forth. So there's such a very the means by which sanctions affect people's lives are extremely complicated, but very cruel indeed. And this is all because these nations, the US and the European Union, have the economic and the military clout to do whatever they like to do to the rest of the world. And they have been doing that since 1492, and they continue to do that. So we are not in a post-colonial world. So maybe one of the political moves for us is to stop using the term post-colonial and only refer to neo-colonialism. And when we talk about the mechanisms of neo-colonialism, it is imperialism. Imperialism in all its aspects, whether it is military, political, economic, and also intellectual imperialism, which has a role in promoting other forms of imperialism and neo-colonialism in general. Now, the fact that we are in a neo-colonial world and that we are dominated in various ways. Talking about Asia, Asians, Africans, and Latin Americans, dominated in so many ways. There has been a great deal of pushback. Certainly among academics and activists, there has been pushback for decades. But of course, our effect on the actual neo-colonial world is minimal, to say the least. What is important is that there is pushback against neo-colonialism from states, from governments, and from other organizations, activists, NGOs, and so on. But the pushback from states is very important. And that has been happening, granted on a very small scale, but it has been happening. And I think some of this has been rather alarming for the Europeans and for the Americans. Just to throw some examples, you have the BRICS movement. Now, one of the projects of the BRICS movement, again, something very slow to develop, but nevertheless alarming for imperialist powers. One of the projects is to de-dollarize the world economy. This is actually something very dangerous for the United States because um, the power of the United States has a lot to do with petrodollars. It has a lot to do with the fact that the world trades in US dollars, um, particularly petroleum being traded in US dollars. Um, when we when we switch to when we have a more diversified basket of currencies in which we trade, especially petroleum, this means a weakening of the U.S. economy, right? And the economists can tell you more about the actual implications of de-dollarization. So this is something I think that is what we need to push for. And indeed, if you look at the war on Iran, one of Iran's responses was along these lines, probably rhetorical, more rhetorical, and I don't think I don't think the Iranians are so naive into thinking that the world is going to switch to other currencies immediately. But nevertheless, Iran did say that ships, nations of ships passing through Straits of Hormuz should finalize their transactions in Chinese yuan. And I think this is a very important point. Again, I don't think Iran is naive into thinking that that would actually be done. But they are making a point. They're contributing to this discourse on de-dollarization and therefore to decolonization. The other thing about Iran is that it's also demanding the dismantling of US bases in the Gulf. Again, this is part of what I had referred to as decolonization at the practical level. They are actually, when they talk about de-dollarization, when they talk about dismantling US bases, they are talking about, they're trying to put a dent into neo-colonialism, into imperialism, at least as far as the Gulf region is concerned, as far as West Asia is concerned. And think about it. The US has, I think, almost 800 military bases around the world, with dozens and dozens in West Asia, in the Gulf region itself. I don't think any other country comes close to having that number of bases beyond its borders. I don't think the British have hundreds of bases around the world, and neither do any of the other countries. How is that tolerable for countries to compromise their sovereignty by allowing so many US bases, by allowing a concentration of US bases, in your region? This is something that is, interesting for us to discuss. Why is it tolerated? How can it be tolerated? So calling for the dismantling of the bases is also part of the move to decolonize, at the practical level, not merely at the discursive level, but at the practical level. So I think all these events, all these activities, the efforts in the world itself, the awareness of the problem of imperialism, of neocolonialism, the pushback from states, from governments, the fragment, and to add to that, the lack of unity within the West itself, the lack of unity within NATO, as we have seen, and U.S. Disappointment with NATO for the Europeans not providing the support that the U.S. expects from NATO. All of this has resulted in the re-emergence of pro-colonial thought. So this is another point that I want to make, that in the decolonization of knowledge, the main categories that we have been discussing all these decades has been anti-colonial thought, which is the critical part of decolonizing knowledge, and the construction of new knowledge, the creation of new knowledge. This is the constructive part of decolonization. But I would also like to suggest that there's another category that we need to pay attention to, which is pro-colonial thought. And I'm not referring to pro-colonial thought of the colonial period, which we are very familiar with. That itself continues needs to be studied, because we've not exhausted it. We have not covered throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America 500 years of colonial thought, pro-colonial thought, as well as 500 years of anti-colonial thought. That itself needs to be done. But there's also this re-emergence of pro-colonial thought that has a different context, to it, in comparison with pro-colonial thought during the colonial period. To put it simply, the context in the colonial period is colonialism. The context today of pro-colonial thought is neo-colonialism. So let me just say a few words about this. What pro-colonial thought in the colonial period and the neo-colonial period have in common is the Eurocentric nature of thought. But pro-colonial thought during the colonial period refers to colonial knowledge that is a reflection of the colonial ideal and material interests at a time when Europeans directly ruled over colonized societies. So here, pro-colonial thought was informed by traits such as false universalisms, distortions, and silencing, all of which function to justify and promote this traditional colonialism, the colonialism of the past. It survives into the neo-colonial period as remnants of the past, and post-colonial theory sees its task as critically examining this survival of the colonial legacy. But pro-colonial thought today, on the other hand, emerges among academics and politicians in what they consider to be a post-colonial age. It is that being in a post-colonial age that moves them to express a longing for the colonial days of yore, when they set out, in the past, from their western shores to rob, pillage, and underdevelop much of the planet since 1492, while at the same time promoting the lofty ideals of their civilizing mission through their intellectual tutelage, missionary activities, and domination. The context of pro-colonial thought today is neo-colonialism rather than traditional colonialism. Now, let me give a few examples. A few years ago, Carolina will remember this, will remember, this is an example of my being Euro-Anglo-centric, Caroline, when I'm calling you Caroline rather than Carolina. Sorry about that. But remember, we were discussing when you were putting together the special issue of the Third World Quarterly, there was some discussion on whether we should go with Third World Quarterly because of the article they published by Bruce Gilley on the case for colonialism. So Bruce Gilley's piece on the case for colonialism is a very good example of the re-emergence of pro-colonial thought. He was making a case for the revival of colonialism, and then we have many recent examples. Some of you may remember the comments made by the late Jürgen Habermas, who refused to refer to the war in Gaza as a genocide, who tended to take the side of Israel, and basically did not express any solidarity with the oppressed people of Palestine. And in fact, it was pointed out by Richard Drayton in a Facebook post, a very interesting post. He said that Habermas could only use the term colonization as a metaphor. The example he gave was how rationality colonizes the life world. So it's using it as a metaphor, but never talked about colonization in terms of real political, economic colonization of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So here you also have kind of pro-colonial thought, and there are many other examples, but there are just a few that I really want to mention because they are so recent and very grotesque, actually very grotesque. Because these examples show that they reflect the re-emergence of pro-colonial thought in a very barbaric and crass manner, without any pretension of civilization. So, the example, Marco Rubio, American Secretary of State, gave a talk at the Munich Security Conference in February, and basically expressed yearning for the days of colonialism, the days when Europe colonized vast parts of the planet. He praised the Europeans for finding America. He praised the whole process without at once referring to the genocide that Europeans and the settlers in America effected or perpetrated on the natives of the Americas. It was never mentioned at all. So you have a very grotesque case, as it were, as if it was making a case for colonialism. It was certainly yearning for the good old days. He glorified the founding of America, as I said, never referring to the perpetration of genocide. He referred to the Christian faith as a sacred inheritance brought from Europe by those who settled what they call the New World, and was not at all nuanced in terms of the differences between humanistic expressions of Christianity, which definitely exist, which should be distinguished from genocidal expressions in the name of Christianity, certainly misusing Christianity. And one can argue that U.S. Secretary of War is misusing the good name of Christianity. He has these tattoos on his body, including the Jerusalem tattoo of the Jerusalem cross. He referred to Muslims as the enemy. He also has the word kafir tattooed in Arabic on his body, and he has been called out by American Muslims for promoting anti-Islamic and Islamophobic ideas. And of course, perhaps the most grotesque is are the statements of Donald Trump, talking about wiping out the whole of Western civilization, Iranian civilization, using what is it called, expletives, when I don't know whether you remember, he talked about, he referred in one of his tweets, I think he referred to the Iranians as crazy bastards, and he asked them to open the effing straits, right? I mean, this is amazing, coming from a statesman. Hardly an expression of the lofty ideals of American civilization. So these are no doubt examples of the re-emergence of pro-colonial thought among politicians. But we also see it gradually emerging among academics. And I feel that these political events in the last years is going to result in more and more of such pro-colonial scholarship among academics emerging. And this is something we need to look out for. So I would therefore reformulate the definition of the decolonization of knowledge to mean, number one, the critique of both the colonial legacy of thought, the remnants of traditional colonial thought in modern day social sciences and humanities, as well as in the political and media discourse, and also pro-colonial, contemporary pro-colonial thought. The critique of contemporary pro-colonial thought in the context of neo-colonialism. So this is the critical. So the critical part of decolonizing knowledge is the critique of colonial legacy, colonial legacies in knowledge creation today, as well as the critique of contemporary pro-colonial thought that emerged in after independence, in the age of neo-colonialism. This is the critical part of decolonization. There's also the constructive part, which means creating new knowledge. So there's the constructive part, which refers to creating new knowledge. I've discussed that elsewhere, and I won't go into the details now. But it is also important that we understand decolonization not only as a decolonization of knowledge, but the practical decolonization of our political economy, basically our lives and the way we live. So I want to conclude with some remarks on that. The Hamas attacks against Israel on October 7th, 2023, which of course invited disproportionate Israeli response in the form of a genocidal war, is an example of the practice of decolonization in the context of a more traditional form of colonialism. Because Gaza, like other parts of Israel, other parts of Palestine rather, are more under the traditional form of colonialism rather than neo-colonialism. Because most of Palestine does not have juridical control over itself. It is colonized by Israel in different ways. Now the war against Iran, on the other hand, so the Palestinian struggle against Israel, which is often referred to as the struggle against Israeli occupation, is to me similar to the traditional anti-colonial resistance of Algeria, of Indonesia, of the Philippines, etc. It is an anti-colonial struggle, and it is an anti-colonial revolution in the making. You know, revolutions in some cases take decades and decades. So what we are seeing, so the Hamas attack was merely an aspect of that anti-colonial revolution, and it has yet to be seen whether this revolution will succeed. Right? And of course, I have to mention that the anti-colonial, to call it an anti-colonial revolution is not to say, is not to whitewash what Hamas has done. It's not to whitewash what any anti-colonial movement might do. It does not mean to say that anti-colonial movements do not engage in wrong acts or even criminal acts. You know, throughout history, anti-colonial movements were liberating movements, were resistance movements consisting of resistance organizations. They were not always angelic. But however we feel about Hamas, and however critical we may be about Hamas in terms of what they may have done, the wrong things they may have done, sociologically speaking, they are not a terrorist organization. They are a resistance organization, and they're part of an anti-colonial struggle. Now, the war against Iran must be understood in the context of neo-colonialism. At least there are at least 3 decolonial moves from this war. Iran is calling for the closing of United States military bases in the Persian Gulf. It wishes to take control over the Straits of Hormuz by charging fees, which is probably unlikely to happen because it is in fact a violation of international law, because according to agreement by international law through I think the United Nations, there's a convention which states that many of the straits around the world, including the Straits of Malacca, of Gibraltar, and that includes the Hormuz Strait, are not to be controlled by any state, and there should be free movement of ships through them. But nevertheless, Iran is making this as a requirement. But the other aspect of the decolonial move is, as I mentioned earlier, asking for payment in Chinese yuan or even Iranian rial. So this is an interesting aspect of decolonization in the form of de-dollarization. In this respect, I just wanted to come back to Cuba. Cuba is of great importance, not merely as a victim of imperialism, but as a hostile opponent and renowned and inspiring symbol of resistance to imperialism. Cuba has been staunchly anti-imperialist since the Cuban Revolution of 1959, a military and political movement that overthrew the dictatorship of Batista, who ruled from 1952 to 1959. I mention this because I think it's unfortunate that we don't pay enough attention to Cuba in terms of both practical decolonization as well as discursive decolonization. We know really little about the kind of scholarship that that has come out of Cuba ever since they fought the wars of independence against the Spaniards in the late 19th century, up until the Cuban Revolution, 1959. And probably the same goes for many other parts of the world where you have strong anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and anti-neo-colonial scholarship. I think the Philippines is a great example. So in both Cuba and the Philippines, you have, Jose Marti in Cuba, turn of the last century, and you have Jose Rizal in the Philippines. They lived at the same time. They were both scholars, intellectuals, writers, and they inspired revolutionary movements in their societies. But only Cubans and Filipinos know about them. They're not household names around the world. They're not as renowned everywhere in the world as figures like Fanon are. And this is, I think, part of our task is to promote these figures. So I think I will end there. I will end with maybe a couple of strong statements. This is on the barbarism of the American regime. The barbarism of the American regime seems to have no limits. This is truly the beginnings of the decline of the West, when it doesn't even pretend to be civilized. The modern West started with uncivilization, when its modernization could only happen in the combination. When its modernization could only happen in combination with slavery, misogyny, colonialism, and capitalism. Silvia Federici, the Italian-American feminist scholar, has shown how the rise of capitalism in Europe took place within the context of the burning of hundreds of thousands of women at the stake in Europe, accusing them of witches, and that this misogyny against women was not simply due to Christian superstition, but rather it was part of the logic of the development of capitalism. It was part of the logic um, of the what is called primitive or original accumulation of capital. The marginalization of women was necessary for the rise of capital. So slavery, colonialism, misogyny, these were constitutive of the rise of capitalism um, in Europe. And this continues till today, the age of neocolonialism, with no attempt by Trump and his cronies to at least feign sophistication and a just outlook. I wonder if the United States can recover from this. The European rulers, for the most part, participate in this barbarism through their failure or reluctance to not only denounce the United States, but take active measures to prevent US aggression around the world. The fact that there are almost 300 US military bases in Europe means that the Europeans have compromised their sovereignty, can never be a source of good, and have no sense of honor or shame. Western civilization is an idea that has not, and it seems will not, become a reality. The West, led by the United States, is therefore a declining hegemonic power. This is not just an objective reality, but is also perceived to be the case by all, including those in the West. While on the decline, the West will fight to regain its glory, and in the process be reckless and bloody due to fear and a rising sense of insecurity. We in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, our citizens, civil society movements, and governments must decide on what side of history to stand. Do we allow for the erosion of international law and sovereignty and the promotion of neocolonialism and imperialism through the active participation in that process, or complicity via silence, or do we join the forces of anti-imperialism? This is what decolonization of knowledge is all about. It's taking a stance against imperialism. And these choices should have been considered decades ago. Thank you.